So welcome and good evening to everyone. This is our second presentation of the year. I'm Brent Taylor, convener of the Speaker Program for Military History and Heritage Victoria. And on behalf of our committee, I welcome you to tonight's Zoom event. Tonight, we're pleased to have Professor Craig Stockings presenting Born of Fire and Ash, Australian Operations in Response to the East Timor Crisis, 1999 to 2000. It's volume 1 of the official Australian official history. I've got to get that round the right way. Now, a little bit about Craig. Craig is the official historian of Australian operations in Iraq, Afghanistan, and East Timor. He's a graduate of both the Australian Defence Force Academy and the Royal Military College Duntroon. As an infantry officer, he served in a range of regimental appointments within the 3rd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment and deployed with Interfet to East Timor in 1999 to 2000. Craig holds first-class honours degree in history, master's qualifications in international relations and education, and a PhD in history. Concurrent with his appointment as official historian, he is Professor of History at the University of New South Wales, Canberra. Craig has written a number of books. It's quite a few, but these include The Torch and the Sword, A History of the Army Cadet Movement in Australia, Zombie Myths of Australian Military History, Swastika Over the Acropolis, reinterpreting the Nazi invasion of Greece in World War II, Battle of Bardia, and more recently, Letters from the Veldt, the Imperial Advance to Pretoria through the eyes of Edward Hutton and his brigade of colonels, and more recently, Britannia's Shield, Lieutenant General Sir Edward Hutton and the late Victorian Imperial Defence. Now, for a little bit of process before Craig begins, most of you will know it, but I'll bring you up to date. Craig will be answering questions at the end of the presentation. You can ask your questions in one of 2 ways. You can post a chat message at any time up to and including question time and address the question to everyone. When the time comes, I'll read your question using your first name or whatever name you have on your computer. Or you can wait and put your hand up during question time and I'll invite you to ask your question verbally. So that's it from me. A little bit. Craig is happy for your screens to be on, but remember that everyone can also see you. Please make sure your microphones are switched off. And by now you should be on speaker view. I now invite Craig to speak.
Thank you, Brent. Very kind of you. You make me blush. You just can't see it through the camera at the moment, mate. Colleagues and friends, I've got to say there's been many an occasion the last 6.5 years I thought that we might not perhaps ever have the opportunity to sit down and talk about the first volume of the official history like we're going to this evening. That is, at certain points and in some solemn moments along what's been, I'd have to say, an interesting road, I wasn't certain we'd ever see the book that exists today, but it does. It's out there, cause enough for me at least for a little bit of celebration. But I'm honoured to have the opportunity to speak to you tonight about Born of Fire and Ash. As Brent said, the first volume of a 6-volume series, Official History of Australian Operations in Iraq and Afghanistan and peacekeeping operations in East Timor. My thanks again, Brent and Jason and the organisers, and to all of you for the opportunity to hear me drone on for a little bit this evening. Now, as indicated, I aim to spend no more than about 25 or 30 minutes giving you something of an overview of the volume and the process that was followed to make it a reality. I won't talk in too much tactical detail about the operations in East Timor themselves, because I'm not sure what you might be specifically interested in, so I'd sooner save that detail to the Q&A, then I can give you sort of answers to more direct questions and follow your interests rather than mine. I think, though, if you'll indulge me, the best or the most appropriate place to start might be just to briefly recap. I know this is a well-informed audience. Briefly recap what official history really means in the 21st century and why this book is different from those that have come before it, even though they've been on the same subject, and will be different also from those that follow it, even when they're written about East Timor. As many of you will know, the tradition of official history in Australia is more than 100 years old, and it's an institution tied intimately to the Australian War Memorial, which has always sponsored such works from the inception of the official history tradition. As such, they're histories of and for all Australians, not for serving people and veterans, though they are part of the audience, but for everybody. So they're detailed and chronological records, I guess, of the theatres and the areas of conflict, and are a resource for the public, as well as those with specialist interest. They are a national asset. That's easy for me to say. Don't mean to sound a bit arrogant. I hope they're a national asset, not a national liability. But they are enduring, authoritative, independent accounts of Australia's experience at war. And I think the last point's worth dwelling upon for a few moments, because there are similar projects than this one across the Anglosphere, but the Australian tradition is the only one where these works are produced outside the system. That is, no public service department, no agency, no arm of government controls the research and production of official history volumes in Australia. No one may direct the contents of the book we're talking about, or the contents of any other of the 5 volumes, or unduly attempt to influence the official historian or the team. In theory anyways, but I'll get back onto that in a little bit later on. In this sense, the histories are official only in as much as they're commissioned by the government as a national record of Australia's involvement in any particular conflict. The official historians and the author teams are granted access to the closed period of classified government records, which is important, yet the volumes contain our interpretations and the judgments don't follow any particular government line. In this sense, they're a record of government actions and decisions based on government records, but they're not government stories. So the histories are a product of historical investigation by independent researchers, one of whom I think is on the call tonight, Ash. Government pays the bill, doesn't decide what's written. But also, I think it's important to understand these works as the first word in the construction of histories around the events they cover, not the last. They allow the public, the veteran community to gain insight into operations in the theatres under examination. To me, this is particularly important today, given what I might describe as a disconnect. Certainly, I observe a disconnect between the wars of the 21st century that we cover and the wider Australian public. I think also it's important because of what we might describe as something of a mismatch between the public narrative of events in East Timor and in the Middle East and the historical evidence at hand. But our outlook as a team has been straightforward. We will not, and we have not self-censored. We will include the bad with the good. Frictions and mistakes are as valid a part of the historical record as are unbridled successes. And in my view, achievements in spite of institutional and other shortcomings tend to enhance the legacy of those involved, not the reverse. So we've written these, we've seen it, and where the evidence trail is indicated. You might have noticed then, if you've looked at the volume, they aim to be truthful, not necessarily triumphal. As many of you will know, the governments thus far since Federation have commissioned 6 separate series of official war histories, one for each major area of conflict the nation's seen, starting, of course, with the official history of the War of 1914-18, edited by Charles Bean. Following Bean, Australia's involvement in World War II was chronicled by Gavin Long and his team as one of the longest and largest historical projects ever seen in the country, running from 1943 to 1977. The third official series was produced under the guiding hand of Professor Robert O'Neill, who was appointed official historian for a Korean War series of 2 volumes published in 1981 and in 1985. Next, and I can see you, Peter. Next, Peter Edwards was appointed as the 4th official historian in 1982 to produce a series on Australia's Southeast Asian conflicts from 1948 right up to 1975. And more recently, in 2004, David Horner was commissioned to write the 5th series relating to post-Cold War peacekeeping operations. I therefore am the 6th official historian appointed, responsible, as I've indicated, for East Timor and Iraq and Afghanistan. Well, to me, colleagues, the national significance of official history speaks for themselves. Australia's involvement only in the Middle East in the 21st century, as you know, has been complex, it's been long running. What some people don't often aren't aware of is more than 40,000 ADF members and civilians served in or supported the deployments in the Middle East over 13 years. Sadly, 44 Australians lost their lives on active service in these theatres, and hundreds more were wounded physically and mentally as well. The social and military effects of these Middle East conflicts is known, and even within Australia has been quite profound. By the same token, Australia's involvement in Timor during the interspet period, is what we're talking about tonight, was the largest mission ever conducted by Australia under UN auspices, the largest deployment of the ADF since Vietnam, depending how you measure it, you might say since World War II, and instrumental as part of getting Timor-Leste gaining its independence. Subsequent deployments gave vital support to the new nation, but taken in total, these operations constitute an important part of the nation's recent past, in my view, one that needs to be chronicled in an authoritative and an analytical manner. And that's what we're about trying to do. Now, there's no question, as I'm sure Peter will attest, that each of the 5 official histories that preceded my own has faced its own unique challenges and enjoyed its own unique advantages. I would say one key difference between this series and that that's gone before it has been the type and level of governance imposed upon us within and external to the project. In stark difference, though, to David Horner's peacekeeping series, I've been well funded for the task to the tune of more than $17.5 million. Have a level of resourcing that would have been unimaginable for past official history series. But the obverse of this resourcing is an extremely tight timeline and pretty rigid governance frameworks. The team initially had 5 years for 6 volumes. That was extended in early 2018 by another 18 months, but it's still a great deal less time than has been available for any previous official history series. Importantly, as was the case for my predecessors, my commission does provide for access to relevant government files under special access conditions of the Archives Act, subject only to national security requirements and restrictions. Though the volumes are published unclassified, obviously, and written with this outcome in mind, they are based on a thorough study of a highly classified documentary record made available by various arms of the government. So material excluded from us and from the publication is only that judged by those departments to be damaging to Australia's national security interests. There hasn't been much taken out of this volume or the project, I think, overall. We've struggled for that to make sure that wasn't the case. That which has been not available to us, I don't think has a material effect on the quality or the stories we're trying to tell. So to take a breath now and talk about the volume itself, I'm not too proud to say this has been a difficult undertaking. Difficult, I think, on 3 levels: on a practical level, on a psychological level, even though I'm not a very emotional person, on an emotional level as well. And I'll take you through those points. On a practical level, the first challenge, given we're writing about the turn of the 21st century, was accessing records, particularly electronic records from government departments and agencies, because it became quickly apparent to me that the bureaucracy looked on events in East Timor and Iraq and Afghanistan with a whole new level of concern and sensitivity than it had with regards to what was perceived as the benign nature of the peacekeeping series that preceded us. So the relatively free hand to David Horner and his team to sift through that I took the job on. Far more appeared to be at stake for various parties. With procedural and structural barriers soon in place, the flow of records to us became unacceptably slow, almost to a crisis point. The events came to a head in early 2017, with Defence as the largest customer for records, as it were, and the net result was an 18-month extension and the raising of a whole new directorate within the department, whose sole job it was to catch and forward material for the project at an acceptable rate. And an acceptable rate was something in the 7,500 documents, not pages, a week that we managed to chew through. In the end, flow rates were attained, but I didn't think we would make it at many stages. I have to admit that by the project, aware of the intricacies and forces and personalities even against which we struggled. But records did begin to flow, and because of that flow, another difficulty soon emerged. This one more methodological for those of you who write history. The challenge here, or the practical challenge, might be described as sort of drowning in a sea of infinite data. So all records created by defence and government officials that in any way relate to those three theatres that I've outlined to you exist in electronic form. So have a think sheet, any other form of data presentation conceivable, and all the drafts of those documents and track changes and all the rest of it have all been retained, and they're all official records. Certainly not all of this data is easily accessed or curated in a form that makes it easy to use. But the point is, I think the amount of material open for historical purpose is almost limitless now. So what then are researchers to do? There will never be enough time to trawl through even a fraction of the record that's available. So a more typical trawling approach where we might try to collect a large proportion of records for interrogation is just not possible in the 21st century. So approaches had to be modified to a more sort of targeted method. So robust sort of filters needed to be built. To a far greater extent than my own experiences, we had to seek specific answers for specific research questions and have to accept that gaps emerged, and we would fill them in a similar way as and when was required. This is a real challenge to the work habits of most of the team. No less a challenge, the psychological impact of infinite data. For myself, for most of the team, in previous research works I've done, I felt pretty good about myself. I felt pretty conscientious when I put my hand on my heart and say I viewed whole or part of the record that was available. I've only ever written history then from what was available and what I've seen. Now, I know in truth this sense of security is always built on a falsehood, right? Because intellectually I'm aware that any record that exists in the archives has already been only ever represents rather a fraction of the material that was ever written. So we might get a file on the Kokoda Trail, for example, and it's got so many pages in it, but that's already been curated. All the rest of the material, all the notebooks, any sorts of piece of paper written, just never made it to an archive. But I found solace in the fact that what lied outside an archive, I couldn't get access to, so nothing could be done. But now it's changed. And the Timor crisis occurred at a point of transition as bureaucracies moved from paper records to electronic ones. So I did benefit a little bit from an archival record, but got a good sense of how the digital sprawl rather, that's become the norm. The question then becomes, with such infinite data available, where to stop? Where's my solace now? All I can say is our mindsets have had to change. We've got deadlines and we've got fiscal constraint, even though we're reasonably well resourced. We need to stop when reasonable answers have been garnered to the questions at hand. We need to be comfortable then with what has not been done. This is, again, not an easy transition, but it's the future of all historical research in the 21st century and beyond. Another difficulty, I don't mind admitting, was the subject matter at hand for this particular volume, because the background reading is disturbing, to say the least. As many of you might know, from the time of the Indonesian invasion of East Timor in 1975, either directly or as a consequence of the policies of occupation, as many as 200,000 East Timorese lost their lives. Out of a population of about 600,000 to 700,000. According to some estimates, this is a higher proportion of death within such a small population than any other 20th century experience. It's a traumatic story, So too in early September 99, when the surge of violence broke out in East Timor, the violence chased away more than a quarter of the 800,000 inhabitants from their homes and killed many, often in gruesome fashions. This is the price that the East Timorese paid for their own self-determination. This is why there was an Australian response. I make special note here to the bravery of journalists who kept the flow of information and disturbing and horrific images out of the province at this period at great personal risk. Scenes of destruction and violence shocked people across the nation. You might remember scenes of 20 to 40,000 people marching in Melbourne for the ADF to get involved in a conflict in a post-Vietnam environment. It was unprecedented. It came into our living rooms from average Australians to members of cabinet, etc., and made a response inevitable. But researching the atrocities perpetuated by anti-independence militias in this period under the guidance, direction, and with support from the Indonesian military was a deeply troubling experience. Yes, history is history, but this was not a pleasant one. So let me now address something of an elephant in the room. Despite those challenges I've listed, perhaps the most difficult, the most traumatic or frustrating or draining part of producing this volume had nothing at all to do with historical research or writing. Rather, the bureaucratic process of clearing the book for publication was its greatest challenge. In all, it took more than 3 years of negotiation, confrontation, and compromise to have the volume approved for publication. Of course, due to the nature of sources used in its preparation, the draft volume was produced as a classified document, and for all the appropriate reasons, it entered a clearance process to ensure it contained no material inappropriate to release into the public domain. That part of the process was relatively quick and actually relatively frictionless and resulted in very minimal changes, certainly none that came close to compromising the integrity of the volume. The area of ambiguity, however, is what might be described or understood as a blurred line between reasonable information security and institutional discomfort in Canberra at various levels. And this discomfort was about content, not classification. A very large part of those 3 years of struggle were discussions, for example, about how much contextual or background material such a volume as this ought to contain. My view was that it needed to be an amount of such material such that a public reader could make sense of events of 1999. This included, for instance, a long-term survey of Australia's policies position with regards to the issue of East Timorese independence. This was not a view shared by all stakeholders. Indeed, it was vigorously contested by some. I remember, ladies and gentlemen, one particularly high-level meeting at where a senior departmental representative congratulated me on such a great book, then asked for the first 9 chapters to be removed on the grounds that the book should begin only when the first Australian boot trod on East Timorese soil. A great way to avoid some uncomfortable policy truth, perhaps, but no way to write history. From here, the back and forth began with agreements reached often only to have a different set of judges raise new objections. Even once this book was published or was on the verge of publication, there remained echoes of arguments long done. The Memorial did not have a book launch for this volume, a remarkable and unprecedented decision, though it did hold an event to mark the book in mid-March. So more broadly, now that we're done with this volume, I'm sometimes asked what were the main themes or threads that emerged during its writing. Well, there are many, but let me share 2 with you, one from veterans and one from a policy perspective. If I were to point to one common refrain from most veterans of East Timor we interviewed, it would be a certain duality of feelings. First, most are rightly proud of their efforts in East Timor. The idea of helping the Timorese is a source of true professional satisfaction and personal satisfaction as well. Witnessing the transition from Dili as a city in flames, the one that was beginning to rebuild in 2000, really sticks in the mind of many, as do the smiling faces of Timorese children and the grateful waves of their parents. At the same time, though, there's discomfort Because it doesn't take long, or it didn't take long, for the average serviceman or servicewoman too busy with the task at hand to be concerned with high policy or strategic calculations in Canberra to understand the terrible acts of violence so recently committed and to understand who was responsible. Indeed, East Timorese often went out of their way to point or physically point out the perpetrators, and at the same time, these same ADF members were then often asked to work with, to conduct joint patrols, for example, their Indonesian counterparts in the full knowledge the roles the latter had played. It was then, it is now, a type of friction few have managed to reconcile. Now, I've tended not to speak about my own experiences in East Timor. They certainly weren't relevant for the preparation of the history, given that I was only a junior officer at the time. But I did so during an ABC interview recently, and I think some of the subject matter is pertinent. I'll share one particular interest with you that illustrates a type of friction that I've just described playing out for me on a very personal level. In this case, my infantry company was stationed at the small town of Mimo on the border with Indonesia, close to the regional hub of Maliana of Balibo 5 fame. On one particular day, we were conducting a small medical clinic for some of the locals who had been gradually returning to the burnout and still smouldering village. I was observing events as the company medic and other soldiers were administering as best they could to the sick and to the injured, when suddenly a woman's desperate and pleading voice rang out, and a young mother with a baby in her arms came running towards us. Some local men were trying unsuccessfully to restrain her sobbing advance. She was distraught with fear or with grief. I didn't initially know which. And she made it to where I was standing. She pushed her baby forth at me, wrapped tight, that she'd been pressing to her chest. I couldn't understand her panic words. I didn't speak Tetum, but it seemed clear she wanted help for her child. The baby, though, was dead. A large contusion on its forehead made it clear that it had been struck, we soon found out, by a militiaman. There's nothing we could do, and the feeling of powerlessness was quite remarkable. At a policy level, let me say this. One very interesting general observation will be the degree to which the public narrative of Australia's role in the East Timor crisis has drifted from the historical truth of events. For much capital appears to have been made by many in the 2 decades that followed based on the nobility and morality of defending the rights of the East Timorese for their own self-determination and defending them physically from the violence perpetuated against them by Indonesian-backed militia groups. The reality, though, is that one's much more complex, yet distillable to a simple truth. Long-term Australian policy was to ensure East Timor remained as a part of the Unitary Republic of Indonesia, not an independent state. This was consistent, or constant rather, even after President Habibie's unexpected announcement of a referendum. The final result of East Timor's independence must be understood as a significant policy reversal for Australia. This is not to suggest that long-term Australian policy towards Timor was without its realpolitik logic. In the words of other authors, the strategic value of the relationship with Jakarta was never going to be sacrificed for the sake of the Timorese. A small, potentially mendicant state to the north was not seen to be in Australia's national interest, nor the potential fragmentation or balkanisation of Indonesia in the context of the Asian financial crisis. As this volume makes clear, Australian policy towards East Timor in 1999 was far more complex than many existing accounts allow, but it was always guided by a deeply realist foreign policy logic, one that was at odds with how much of the Australian public saw the world and Australia's place within it in 1999. These 2 very different views became aligned only in September of that year, and policy did change at that point. When it was clear there was no option other than a military intervention, then the full policy apparatus swung in behind this requirement, but not by choice. Rather, because of a series of events outside of Canberra-based bureaucratic control. As a historian, I observe that in such instances where there is such a divergence between public policy and public will, there will invariably be a reckoning. I'm no policymaker, I don't pretend to be, but significant variances such as this are a dangerous phenomenon and they tend not to last. A second question I'm occasionally asked is what are the most surprising specific discoveries made during the process of researching the volume? And to this question, I note one of the most startling individual findings for me was connected to Prime Minister Howard's famous letter to President Habibie in December of 1998. Often portrayed as a significant government policy change, it was in fact nothing of the sort, despite claims to the contrary subsequently. Now, this letter suggested that Indonesia should consider granting East Timor a type of autonomy with a built-in review mechanism for self-determination at some future and unspecified date. Mr. Howard never advocated independence. Why would he? That was not Australia's policy position. The bonus here would be that if such a non-specific process was begun, it might take the heat out of the East Timor issue at home and abroad, remove the burr under the saddle and smooth out the relationship between Canberra and Jakarta. For his part, President Habibie wanted to solve what he saw as the Timor problem. He and some of his advisors believed the province was a money sink. This was not seen in the same way by the Indonesian military. He had already announced, that is, in the middle of 1998, that he was ready to consider a special status for East Timor. And after a deal of hollow bluster about Australian imperialist meddling aimed at a domestic audience, at a fateful cabinet meeting in January 1999, Habibie brandished the letter John Howard had sent in the previous month, suggesting after a period of autonomy, there would be an act of self-determination in East Timor the next year. And the rest is history. Now, the remarkable facet about this process was that the fact was this letter was drafted by a very small coterie of individuals from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet, communicated by Mr. Downer, the Foreign Minister, to Mr. Howard as a good idea. At no point did anyone think to include the Department of Defence in this process. Indeed, to his considerable chagrin, the acting Secretary of Defence found out about the letter's existence only after it had been sent. And this was remarkable, I think, given rhetoric of whole of government at the time and the role that Defence went on to play in East Timor. Now, amidst all of these difficulties and problems that I've discussed, let me make one thing rather really clear, or underscore one important counterpoint. That is, International Force East Timor, or Interfet, was a resounding success. It's a story all veterans and the wider community ought to be proud. If the Defence Forces were perhaps underprepared, and they were, if the policy framework was contorted, if the strategic context complex, then it's a greater testament to the skill and commitment and professionalism to all of those who are involved. For it's one thing to succeed when everything's running smoothly, it's another to do so under significant pressure and despite the faults in the machine. So as far as I'm concerned, double praise to all involved, not just those who deployed to Timor, but the tens of thousands back in Australia who worked hard in support of deployed troops. Contribution of these individuals tends to go a bit unsung, but it was crucial nonetheless. Now, there is danger, as I know you all know, of putting an academic in front of a microphone of any sort, even if it's a Zoom microphone, because I've talked too long. But the role of official historian, Prime Minister Turnbull wrote, who commissioned me in this job, is one of great national significance in ensuring the production of authoritative, comprehensive, and accurate accounts of Australia's military operations. That's quite a responsibility. I feel not only the weight of tradition here, but of expectation too. And I only hope, therefore, that the book is judged worthy of the efforts of all those who are involved in East Timor in the crisis of 99 and 2000, worthy too of public expectations. But my thanks for your time, one and all. Is it me? I can't hear you, Brent. Oh, you're muted.
Yes. A rookie mistake. I shouldn't be making that. So thank you very much, Craig. That was tremendous. All the problems that you came across, and I can sympathise with the data problem. It's easy to generate. We'll start with a question, actually the last question come in from Graham. Did Indonesia have a genuine claim to East Timor based on ethnicity, history, culture, etc.?
No. No, if we go back right to the 16th century, there's the East Timor is a Portuguese colony. West Timor is a Dutch colony. There's very different religious and cultural traditions in both. Catholicism being a key one in East Timor. There was always a sense of nascent nationalism in East Timor, which the Indonesian occupation never managed to extinguish. So is there a legitimate claim? There can always be cases made for legitimate claims, but East Timor was never part of the Dutch East Indies or the nation centred on Java that resulted from that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Tony's asked, what's the structure of the 6 volumes of the current official history?
Oh, no worries, Tony. So we have 2 series within the 6. There's 2 volumes on East Timor, the first of which we're talking about tonight, the second of which is currently under, that's 99-2000, the second of which is currently under clearance by the departments, and that's the peacekeeping period from 2000 to 2012. Then we have a 4-volume set on the Middle East. The first volume is the Middle East Area Operations, 2000 to 2005. That's largely a naval story with a little bit of special operations. Then there's a single large Iraq volume, 2003 to 2011. Then there is an Afghanistan volume, 2005 to 10, and another Afghanistan volume, 2010 to 14. And 14 was when our mandate finishes, where the first or large-scale withdrawal from Afghanistan occurs.
Right. Andrew.
Craig, good evening. Good to see you again. And I remember having a chat with you under a tree near the War Memorial about the challenges you were facing at the time, and you were a bit downhearted. I must say that I walked away with that impression, but it's really good that the history's been, this one's got out and running. You made a comment during your presentation about working with Indonesian military people and probably civil people as well that had been involved in, atrocities, if that's the right word, on the Timorese side, against the Timorese. How much pressure did you get in writing this history to water down or minimise those sorts of considerations for diplomatic reasons? No doubt the Indonesian government has read this volume too.
No doubt. Andrew, less than you'd think. This is not news to Jakarta. They've had their own legal processes. In fact, some individual officers were charged over what occurred. Not that too many were convicted, but some were. There's also been the Truth and Reconciliation report between East Timor and Indonesia, which goes into far more gruesome and specific detail than we do. So it is clear public record that this occurred and who was pulling the strings. It's also clear if you jumped on the web, Google now, and looked at unclassified UN documents. They were reporting pretty accurately. So this is actually news to no one. It just hasn't been talked about in an explicit or official way. If there was pressure, it might have been couched about what would the Indonesians going to think and say. But I think it's the real pressure points are closer to home, to do with perhaps institutional reputations, these sorts of things.
I suppose in view of today's news about Ben Roberts, that we will have that situation in reverse in future years when you come to the Afghanistan volumes.
Yeah, all interesting challenges for the future, Andrew, I'm sure.
Better you than me.
Peter, your microphone's off. There we go.
But, well, Craig, firstly, congratulations on a magnificent book. I may say that carrying it back from the post office to my home, I didn't need to go to the gym. It's not a lightweight effort in any sense, but it's a huge triumph, and the the first half of it is all on before the people actually landed, and I happen to think that's thoroughly appropriate. But what I'd like to ask you about tonight is, you point out that this is a quite unprecedented form of engagement for Australian forces. We're very accustomed to fighting as part of coalitions as one of the junior partners. But this was the occasion where, as you do point out, we had American support, but very tightly limited, and Australia had to lead. And this is where, of course, Peter Cosgrove made his reputation. Could I just ask you, how do you feel that the Australians in general, and General Cosgrove in particular, fared as leaders of an international coalition when we didn't have a great power to do the lead? We were the de facto great power, if you like, leading a coalition from different continents, let alone, and some of which we probably didn't have many previous associations with.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Yes, you're right, of course. There's very few American boots on the ground, a dozen, 2 dozen. There's 500 odd more floating offshore. So yeah, we are there without the Americans being very visible, but let's be clear, they're there. It's the American diplomatic and economic force that's been applied onto Jakarta, which allows a deployment to occur. Without the US backstopping us, indeed, the blank check in case things got out of hand, buttressing us, we would not have been there. So the Americans, whilst not being visible, are absolutely key here. Jakarta is more interested in the International Monetary Fund in Washington than it is in Canberra, even if they're the centre of our worlds, we're not the centre of theirs all the time. But you're right, of course, not as many boots on the ground. How did we go? I think General Cosgrove did a great job. He had to sit across a political and military divide, had to manage a coalition and manage a relationship with TNI, or Indonesian Armed Forces, all at once, in the full knowledge of what's going on, because the intelligence pictures are pretty clear. I think he did a very good job doing that. Now, I would say overall the ADF fell over the line here. We arrived. There was no opposition because the opposition was turned off in Jakarta quite deliberately. And it was still hard because this was the peacetime ADF of the 1990s, where there had been, can't remember how many efficiency reviews, and the word efficiency really meant cost-cutting reviews for the ADF. So it was not a force structured or capable of projecting power in any significant way. That doesn't mean the people involved didn't work hard, weren't professional, made things work, because they certainly did, but the system around them was not ready. We learned a lot from 1999. Then we forgot it again, and maybe it's been learned again since. Because deploying packets of 200 and 300 people at a time to the Middle East under someone else's logistic and administrative and strategic infrastructure is very different from trying to do it alone. Maybe we've got a bit of a false sense of security there. Had there been an opposition in East Timor, I think some of those obvious cracks might have been even more profound. Let me just say I think there were 2 petroleum operators in the ADF at the time, the 2 hardest working people in the room in 1999. Had one of them got sick, I'm not sure what would have happened.
Mm. Were the forward troops, I remember talking to the late Jim Truscott about him coming off the Hercules, the first Hercules to land at Dili, and they were all gunned up and ready to start firing, according to Jim, and then they were totally shocked to find there was a whole welcome committee, including the Indonesians, lining up there and saluting, and he said it was quite an anticlimax. What were our first folks going in there expecting?
And including meeting Ken Brownrugg as the attaché in his polyesters and aiguillettes, sort of shaking hands.
Exactly.
Yeah, there was a disconnect there about what was expected and what was actually going to be reality. This all happened pretty quickly. There was perhaps a sense of distrust in Canberra about the messages coming out of Dili. bit of Stockholm syndrome maybe from Ken and others, I'm not sure. There were certainly intelligence briefings that even I can recall that sort of prepared soldiers for Stalingrad. That's not what they found. When we had one RAR jumping off its aircraft and digging holes around the airfield ready for some sort of counterattack, we were invited into East Timor, or we wouldn't have been there. Now, that doesn't mean that incidents couldn't have happened and people couldn't have been killed. In fact, there were quite a number of sharp contacts, but that was going to be a fight with a small part of the militia or the being an arm of TNI. It was never going to be a fight with the corporation of TNI. If that was on the cards, we wouldn't have been there, Andrew. So yes, dangerous, but not war-fighting dangerous, because that's not the point. In fact, it's a strange sort of things happening in parallel, welcomed by the Indonesian military, who have the cause of the problem from the outset, and we know that, they know that we know that, and we get on with it. The East Timorese have a simpler view. But the situation described is very true.
Thank you.
Graham.
Craig, was there some sort of inter-service confusion between the Navy and the Army on their deployment from Darwin?
Yep.
Would you like to expand on that a little bit?
There's heaps of examples of that. Remember, again, this is a peacetime ADF. Everybody talked about tri-service, so nobody believed it. I mean, that's what's in the pamphlets, right? Not what was in people's hearts. I know there was one particular incident in Darwin that was pretty visible in the press, where a cavalry regiment loaded itself onto the brook, and then it was told not to go. It was told to go. It unloaded. It loaded back up. That was just a bit of command confusion between the brigade and higher. This was an unpracticed chain of command. Things tended to devolve to along service lines, and tri-service headquarters like Australian Theatre really were put out towards the edges as a bit of a postal box rather than actual commanding organisation. And there's lots of reasons for that. But you've hit the nail on the head. Real tri-services, not so much in 99, just the veneer. And when things get difficult, people fall back onto what they know. And there's heaps of other examples of the pretty frosty reception Air Force and naval officers got at the deployable joint headquarters, which was essentially an army headquarters, and all sorts of frictions and difficulties there. And most of them overcome with professionalism, but the system creaked, I think is a fair thing to say, Graham.
Thank you.
Raman.
Hi, Greg. This is Raman, and so I was in a 6 RAR. Probably know that
you're in the second volume, Raman.
Actually, look, I was so eager to see you. Watching you since in the volume is initiated in the under the Tony Abbott in the prime ministership. Just looking forward actually to what has happened, and I admire your integrity, and you stick up with your gun, and I think you succeeded. Absolutely.
I had hair when we started, Raman.
Sorry.
I had a full head of hair when we started.
Yes, and I also just in relation with you mentioned about John Howard. He actually visited my workplace in the 2012 or 13 in Fisherman Bend, the General Motor Holden, and he's preparing for his Menzies years documentary about his volume for his political mentor. And I met with him. I said to him, Mr. Howard, thank you very much to send us an Australian contribution to East Timor. And he just grabbed my hand, and exactly basically what he said, you mentioned that. And he said to me, no, don't give me thank you. East Timor is helping us during the Second World War time. And Peter Cosgrove did good job.
He did. One of the challenges, Raman, for politicians and John Howard in 1999 is they had a situation where, because people could see what was happening on TV, right? So we had pressure from the Commando Association and the RSL. and pressure from the activists and lefts all at the same time. And that's a really uncomfortable position for a Conservative Prime Minister. So yes, policy changed when there was no option for it, if that makes sense. Now, Mr. Howard, he may not agree with the conclusions in the book. In fact, I'm pretty sure that he doesn't.
And once again, thank you very much and congratulations.
Thank you, mate.
Another one from Peter.
Yeah, if I may have another go.
Of course.
Craig, you make the point that letter, the famous Howard letter to Habibie, was drafted by a very small group of people from mostly foreign DFAT people, and that defence, even at the highest levels, had no idea about it, let alone were not involved in the in its preparation or even delivery. They didn't know about it until it had gone. It does occur to me that there's something similar that's gone on, and you may well not want to comment on this, but I do note that the most significant strategic decision taken in recent times, our commitment to nuclear-powered submarines under the AUKUS agreement, was arranged by a very tiny handful of politicians and officials, and a hell of a lot of the Defence Department and the services, let alone other people, were not even aware that this was contemplated until it was announced suddenly on the 18th of September 21. So would you draw from that that there are long-term risks in taking major decisions, which have long-term strategic importance, other than on the basis of at least a whole of government, if not a whole of nation basis, where there's been considerable consultation and discussion before the final decision is taken?
Well, what you suggest sounds eminently sensible to me, Peter, but I'll be really honest, I don't know enough about the AUKUS decision-making process to make sensible comment. And I would be as bad as some of those I criticise sometimes, just speculating. So, I mean, what you say makes perfect sense, but I can't really offer any more of an informed opinion than anyone else, my friend, or I'd just be guessing.
Fair enough.
So are there any more questions? There's a couple of comments on the chat if people would like to have a look at those before we go. But Jason's got a question.
I do have one. It's not actually a question, Craig. Thank you for coming. I've been sent a message by a veteran of the East Timorese campaign, former president of MHHV and current international traveller. It's basically the last line of his review of your book. And you've alluded to this. It is tremendous that Born of Fire and Ash has finally been published. The fact that it took 23 years to be published is lamentable, but one hopes that the remaining volumes follow in quick succession from now. Is that the expectation?
Jason, I can tell you that the remaining volumes will be produced on time and on schedule by the project. What I can't control is the pace of the clearance of those volumes. Now, the expectation for that clearance process is 6 months. The first one took 3 years. The second one is just getting past the 6-month period now. I can tell you that we will do our best, but there is a line of credibility and integrity that we won't cross. We could make this go really quickly and really painlessly just by doing what we're asked, which we will do, except and where it starts to undermine the credibility of what we're trying to do. I don't know what the problems are going to be for the Middle East volumes. Maybe there'll be none. And we'll all sail through and I'll catch the pigs flying by. I don't know what they're going to be, but so we can control what we can control. I don't expect everything to be seamless and smooth, no.
No. Well, I'll just do the shameless plug for us. That particular review was on the MHHV website, along with, I think, one or two others, if people are interested in reading them. We've only put up favourable reviews because they're the only ones that have been offered to us, Craig. So that's a good sign, I think.
That's refreshing. Thank you. I thought you might have been being kind. There's a question, I think, is it from Marie? I've got on my screen, noting the experience on the border areas where Maliana and Mimo sort of are, noting that there are connections across that area between East and West Timor that don't really follow a map. There are just deep family and familial connections. I couldn't agree more, Marie. And to extend your point, that's really borne out in the resistance struggle itself. Many of the more strident independence advocates were always from the East rather than from the border areas in the West. So there are tribal divides, as you've mentioned, and cultural divides there as well. The borders are never as neat as a line on a map. So I think you're absolutely right.
Can I make a further comment, please?
Certainly.
That actually reminds me of going back to World War II. The independent companies that operated there very early in 1942 were successful to a point while they were in the West. But in the Portuguese side, as recently we brought up in a conference, the special forces chaps trying to infiltrate into Portuguese Timor and set up anti-Japanese resistance was a complete and utter failure, and mostly because the local population didn't support them at all. And
That's
actually,
right.
yeah. And so I think those cultural differences were quite strong.
And it was a point of historical fact. We actually invaded Portuguese East Timor in the 40s because the governor certainly wasn't made aware. And you can make a case can be made, borderline case to be made, that our presence encouraged the Japanese to land in Portuguese Timor and start a very difficult occupation. We certainly didn't ask the locals.
Yeah, well, the Timorese haven't had a good run since 1942, really.
Can I, as my father was part of Sparrow Force, I think there is a fairly significant area for discussion in those statements. Which I think would take up more time than we have here.
But I do understand the point, a point that you make, Graham. Everything's much more murky than sometimes it's portrayed.
Yes, certainly sounds like it. Are there any more questions? If there's not, I'll wrap up. Is that you again, Jason?
Yeah, sorry, I do have one more. It's more of a related to being the official historian, Craig. Having read them all, including Bean's work, did you feel that a pressure in terms of the great work that went before, and a pressure to produce as accurate a volume?
I felt and I feel pressure, significant pressure, Jason. I don't feel pressure to create another Bean series because that's the product of its time.
Yep.
It's written in a certain way and in response to certain expectations of the era. So I'm really happy that the official histories have evolved in line with the times. We are able, for example, to be a bit more critical of government policy and whatnot nowadays because the community is open to that sort of reception. It would be just it would be considered have a non-respectable thing to do, right, in the turn of the century. But 100 years later, the community's more expects that sort of thing. So I don't feel pressure to be the same. I just feel pressure to get it right, mate.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Or to do the best job that was able to be done within the time and the constraints that we have. That's all.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you.
And you have.
Thank you, mate. Only one down, but thank you. It means a lot, Peter.
There's another note here from Marie Sheehan, if anyone would like to read this, but I think we'll wind up now. Tremendous presentation. wasn't exactly what I thought we were going to get, but it was all so much better.
Yeah, look, I thought I have written one that was just a sort of a detailed sort of chronology of Interfet, but I figure that many of you people sort of know that already. And what you didn't sort of know, we might have talked about in the Q&A, which we've done. So if it's not what you were expecting, then my apologies. I thought it might be useful anyway.
Much better.
No, it was tremendous. Thank you. So we've just got a couple of little bits of business to deal with following this. Well, let's show appreciation in the normal way, of course.
Thank you.
Silent clap.
Clearly forgot that. But if you don't want to hang around to listen to it, feel free to wander off, and we'll just be a couple more minutes, everyone, if you just hold on, and that's it, really. That's it from
Brent,
us.
I'm going out to dinner with my wife, so I might bid you all adieu.
Yeah, Craig.
Thank you.
Craig,
Thank you.
I did send you an email today to your Adfer address. I don't know if you've seen it, but could you check your emails there,
I
please?
certainly will do. I certainly will do, Andrew.
Thank you.
Good night, all.
Thanks for giving us the time. Bye.
Thanks, Craig.
So we don't have much more to discuss. We're in the next couple of days, as usual, we'll be sending out information about Craig's books, and just a little bit of an advertising about our next speaker, which is our distinguished historian, Dr. Andrew Kilsby, discussing his new book. Andrew was here today, of course.
He'll have a cat with him, though, I believe.
Yes. Andrew, were you cleaning the lens on your camera with that cat?
I have to put him in the naughty room half the time because I can't work. He just wants to sit on my lap, on my desk, and see what's going on. Just a curious cat. But nice.
Didn't curiosity kill the cat?
Yeah, I feel like killing him sometimes when I'm busily writing and I'm going for leather and he comes in and you end up holding a cat and typing with one finger, and it's very frustrating.
So anyway, Andrew is going to present Eaten by Moths, Defending the Defence Reserves 1970 to 2020. And that'll be on Zoom on Wednesday, the 12th of July, 7 o'clock as usual. And that's really all we've got to report. So it brings evening sessions to a close. Thanks to Jordan, as always, for keeps everything going behind the scenes. And thank you all for joining us. Hope you come again. Good night to you from the committee and myself.